They didn't exile an emperor, they unleashed a monster. Capri, 26 AD. The Mediterranean wind carried the scent of jasmine and decay, while waves crashed against limestone cliffs that would become Rome's most infamous prison. Here, on 12 square miles of paradise, the most powerful man in the world would either find salvation or damn his soul forever. The morning Tiberius Caesar boarded that final galley to Capri, Rome held its breath. Senators whispered prayers of relief. Citizens counted coins, wondering if their emperor's retreat meant peace or catastrophe. None suspected they were witnessing the birth of a legend so dark that historians would debate its truth for 2 millennia. If you enjoy these dark histories that peel back the rotting flesh of power, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories of human corruption find their audience across the world. Tiberius Claudius Nero, the name itself prophetic. Claudius meaning lame, Nero meaning strong. He was Rome's walking contradiction, a man split between duty and desire, honour and horror. Picture him. 6 feet tall in an age of shorter men, with shoulders that had carried shields across Germanic battlefields. His face was a map of old wounds, a scar above his left eye from a Germanic spear, another along his jaw from a fall during a cavalry charge. But his eyes told the real story, cold, calculating. The eyes of a man who had seen too much death to fear it, too much betrayal to trust it. Augustus had shaped him like a blade, sharp, deadly, but brittle. 22 years of military campaigns, 9 years governing the empire's most turbulent provinces, every victory bought with Roman blood, every peace treaty signed over Roman corpses. Tiberius was Rome's perfect weapon, but weapons don't rule, they kill. Then there was Augustus himself, the divine stepfather, the golden emperor who had transformed Rome from republic to empire, while pretending nothing had changed. Augustus was silk wrapped around steel, honey poured over poison. He ruled for 45 years by making everyone believe they still lived in a republic while bowing to a god. But gods age, gods die. And when Augustus breathed his last in 14 AD, he left behind an empire that had forgotten how to function without him. The Senate was a theatre troupe pretending to govern. The people were addicts hooked on bread and circuses. The army was a machine that existed to conquer, not to protect. Into this void stepped Tiberius, a general asked to play emperor, a weapon expected to govern, a man trained to destroy now demanded to create. For 11 years he tried. Gods, how he tried. He cut imperial spending, strengthened provincial defences, reformed the legal system. He was everything Augustus had trained him to be, competent, ruthless, effective. But Rome didn't want competent. Rome wanted theatre. Therefore the Senate hated him. They mourned Augustus's divine charisma and cursed Tiberius's administrative efficiency. They wanted a god-emperor who would smile and wave while they played their political games. Instead, they got a soldier who read every document, questioned every expense, and remembered every slight. The people hated him too. Augustus had given them spectacles, gladiator games that lasted weeks, chariot races that shook the Circus Maximus, naval battles in flooded amphitheatres. Tiberius gave them balanced budgets and military discipline. He was medicine when they wanted wine. But the aristocracy, the old families who had ruled Rome before Caesar, who had survived Augustus by bending like reeds, they hated him most of all. Because Tiberius saw through their games. He knew their debts, their conspiracies, their whispered treasons. And unlike Augustus, who had played politics like chess, Tiberius treated treason like a disease. He cut it out. 25 AD, the year everything shattered, Sejanus, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Tiberius's most trusted advisor, his closest friend. If Tiberius was Rome's sword, Sejanus was its poison. Smooth where Tiberius was rough, charming where the emperor was cold, beloved where his master was feared. For 8 years, Sejanus had been the perfect subordinate. He consolidated the Praetorian Guard into a single camp just outside Rome. For efficiency, he claimed. He expanded their numbers for security. He placed his men in key positions throughout the government for loyalty. Tiberius saw strength where there was ambition, friendship where there was manipulation. The old soldier, brilliant in war, was blind to the coup growing in his own shadow. Then came the deaths. Drusus, Tiberius's son and heir, struck down by sudden illness in 23 AD. Germanicus, the emperor's nephew and adopted son, poisoned in Syria in 19 AD. One by one, Tiberius's potential successors fell to fever, accident, and mysterious ailment. Modern historians debate the evidence, but ancient Romans knew poison when they smelled it. The aristocracy whispered, the Senate murmured, and at the centre of every whisper, every murmur was the same name, Sejanus. But Tiberius trusted. Despite every instinct screaming danger, despite every omen pointing toward betrayal, he trusted. Because in 57 years of life, Sejanus was the only man who had never asked him for anything except the chance to serve. That trust nearly destroyed the world. By 25 AD, Sejanus controlled the Praetorian Guard, influenced the Senate, and commanded the loyalty of half the aristocracy. He was emperor in everything but name. All he needed was for Tiberius to disappear. Not die, disappear. Let the old man retreat to some distant villa where he could play at philosophy while Sejanus governed Rome. Let him fade away while younger, stronger hands guided the empire. Therefore, Sejanus began his masterpiece, the systematic destruction of Tiberius's will to rule. It started with small things. Reports that arrived just a day late. Meetings that somehow conflicted with other appointments. Senators who suddenly had urgent business elsewhere when the emperor requested their presence. Sejanus was artist of alienation. He convinced Tiberius that the Senate plotting against him, which was true. He persuaded the emperor that the people mocked him, also true. He demonstrated that the aristocracy conspired in shadows, absolutely true. But here was Sejanus's genius. He never lied. He simply made sure that every truth Tiberius learned painted Rome as a nest of vipers, and Sejanus as the only honest snake. Day by day, meeting by meeting, report by report, Sejanus built a cage of paranoia around the emperor's mind. And Tiberius, exhausted by 11 years of thankless rule, began to believe that Rome would be better off without him. The final push came in late 25 AD, a conspiracy, real this time, involving several senators and members of the imperial family. The details remain murky, but the outcome was clear. More executions, more trials, more hatred directed at the emperor who seemed to see treason in every shadow. Because he did. Because it was there. Because Sejanus had made sure it was always there. That winter, as Rome shivered under grey skies and greyer politics, Tiberius made his decision. He would leave the capital, temporarily, he told himself, just long enough to let tempers cool, conspiracies collapse and sanity return. Sejanus suggested Capri. Beautiful, isolated, defensible. A place where the emperor could rest while his loyal prefect handled the tedious business of governance. Tiberius agreed. The most powerful man in the world signed his own exile. 26 AD. Spring. The imperial galley cut through morning mist toward an island that looked like paradise and functioned like purgatory. Capri rose from the Tyrrhenian Sea like a limestone dream. White cliffs crowned with olive groves, hidden grottos carved by millennia of waves, villas perched on precipices that seemed to touch the sky. Augustus had loved it here, building palaces and gardens that turned rock into Eden. But Augustus had visited. Tiberius came to stay. The imperial retinue that landed that April morning numbered in the hundreds. Praetorian guards, household slaves, scribes, cooks, entertainers, physicians, astrologers, and philosophers. An entire government in miniature, transplanted to 12 square miles of isolated beauty. For the first months, it worked. Tiberius governed by letter and messenger, making decisions that reached from Britain to Egypt, while standing on terraces that overlooked fishing villages and merchant ships. He was still Caesar, still Augustus, still the divine emperor, just with better weather and fewer senators. But isolation is a drug. The first taste soothes, the second intoxicates, the third enslaves. By winter, Tiberius had stopped reading most dispatches from Rome. By the following spring, he was ignoring requests from provincial governors. By 28 AD, The man who had once micromanaged an empire was spending his days studying Greek philosophy and his nights staring at stars. The world's most powerful hermit had found his cave. What happens to power when it stops being used? It doesn't disappear. It metastasizes. Tiberius still possessed absolute authority over 60 million people, but he wielded it in increasingly arbitrary ways. A single word from Capri could raise armies or raise cities, but that word came only when the emperor's mood or paranoia or boredom demanded it. The signs of mental deterioration came slowly, then all at once. Servants reported that Caesar would spend entire days without speaking, staring at the sea as if waiting for messages from the dead. Other days he would fly into rages over trivial matters, a poorly prepared meal, a letter delivered late, a slave who moved too quickly or too slowly. The emperor who had once commanded legions now commanded only an island, but he ruled that island like a petty god. Every pleasure was available, every desire fulfilled, every whim indulged. There were no senators to question his decisions, no citizens to judge his actions, no traditions to constrain his appetites. For the first time in his life, Tiberius was completely free. The result was completely terrifying. Here we must pause to address a critical issue with our sources. Almost everything we know about Tiberius's behavior on Capri comes from accounts written decades after his death by senators and elite historians who had every reason to hate him. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, our primary sources, were writing for audiences that remembered Tiberius as a tyrant who had executed their fathers and grandfathers for treason. More importantly, accusing unpopular emperors of sexual perversion was virtually a literary requirement in Roman historiography. Caligula was accused of incest, Nero of matricide and pederasty, Commodus of gladiatorial exhibitionism. The pattern is so consistent that modern historians recognize it as political propaganda rather than historical fact. We have no contemporary neutral accounts of what actually happened on Capri, no letters from disgusted servants, no reports from horrified visitors, no official records of the alleged crimes. The lurid details about swimming boys and systematic child abuse appear only in sources written long after Tiberius was safely dead and unable to retaliate. This doesn't mean Tiberius was innocent. Slavery and pederasty were tragically normalized in Roman society, and absolute power certainly enabled abuse. But the specific image of Tiberius as a monstrous paedophile orchestrating orgies of child abuse is almost certainly propaganda designed to justify his posthumous damnation. But legends care nothing for historical accuracy. They care only for the deeper truths that facts cannot capture. What we know with certainty is this. Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire from Capri for 10 years, without returning to Rome even once. He transformed from a competent, if harsh, administrator into an increasingly paranoid recluse who governed by rumour and executed by whim. What the Romans believed, and what they needed to believe, was something far more visceral and damning. They believed in Villa Jovis, Tiberius's cliff-top palace, where the emperor supposedly indulged appetites that would make demons blush. They spoke of the Spintriae, young men and women trained in exotic sexual practices, imported from across the empire to satisfy Caesar's increasingly bizarre desires. They whispered about the little fishes, boys who were trained to swim between the emperor's legs in his private pools, performing acts too depraved for decent Romans to name aloud. They described elaborate sexual theatres, where prisoners and slaves were forced to perform for the emperor's entertainment before being thrown from the cliffs. They told stories of guests who arrived at imperial dinners to find the evening's entertainment was watching condemned criminals being tortured in increasingly creative ways. They claimed that Tiberius had become so paranoid that he employed food tasters, poison detectors, and astrologers to examine every meal, every drink, every visitor for signs of assassination. Most damning of all, they painted Tiberius as a man who had abandoned his duty to Rome in favour of personal pleasure. While barbarians threatened the borders and conspirators plotted in the capital, Caesar was allegedly playing with his toys on a private island, indifferent to everything except his own gratification. Strip away the graphic embellishments, and a different picture emerges, arguably more tragic than the lurid legend. Tiberius was probably not a sadistic pedophile, but he was almost certainly a broken man. 57 years old when he reached Capri, he had spent his entire adult life in service to an empire that had never loved him. He had conquered Germania, governed Syria, and administered Rome with competence that won no gratitude and efficiency that earned no affection. His wife Vipsania, the only woman he ever truly loved, had been taken from him for political reasons and married to another man. His brother Drusus had died young in Germania. His adopted son Germanicus had been poisoned in Syria. His biological son Drusus had died under suspicious circumstances in Rome. Everyone he trusted betrayed him. Everyone he promoted conspired against him. Everyone he loved died young. By the time he reached Capri, Tiberius was less emperor than refugee, a man fleeing not just Rome, but the weight of a world that had demanded everything and given nothing in return. Did he indulge in sexual excess? Probably, to some degree. Absolute power combined with deep isolation has always produced behavioral extremes. Did he become increasingly paranoid and arbitrary? Certainly. The historical record of executions and trials speaks for itself. But the image of Tiberius as a gleefully sadistic paedophile, orchestrating elaborate sexual torture chambers, is almost certainly a myth created by enemies who needed to justify their hatred of a man who had been, by the standards of his time, a competent but unloved ruler. While Tiberius played hermit on his island paradise, Sejanus was busy becoming emperor in everything but name. The Praetorian prefect had consolidated power with surgical precision. He controlled access to Tiberius, filtering every message that reached Capri and editing every response that left it. He placed his supporters in key positions throughout the government. He eliminated potential rivals through trials, exile, or convenient accidents. Most cleverly, he convinced the Senate that he was protecting them from Tiberius's paranoia, while simultaneously convincing Tiberius that he was protecting the emperor from senatorial conspiracies. Both sides trusted him, because both sides feared each other more than they feared him. By 29 AD, Sejanus was receiving honours normally reserved for the emperor. Statues of him appeared in theatres and temples. His birthday was celebrated as a public holiday. Senators competed to praise his wisdom and loyalty. He was so close to absolute power that he could taste it. All he needed was one final push. Some crisis or conspiracy that would justify removing Tiberius permanently and installing himself as regent for the emperor's young heirs. But Sejanus had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Tiberius's retreat to Capri represented surrender, the abdication of a broken man who no longer cared about power. He was wrong. Tiberius may have been physically absent from Rome, but his intelligence network remained intact. Spies, informants, and loyal agents continued to report directly to Capri, bypassing Sejanus's filters through secret channels that the prefect never suspected. Slowly, carefully, the emperor began to piece together the scope of his friend's betrayal, the convenient deaths of potential heirs, the systematic promotion of Sejanus's supporters, the gradual isolation of loyalists, the carefully orchestrated campaigns to convince both Senate and Emperor that the other posed a mortal threat. Sejanus had played his game brilliantly, but he had forgotten that Tiberius was not just a politician, he was a general, and generals understand that the most effective battles are won through deception, patience, and overwhelming force applied at the perfect moment. Throughout 30 AD, Tiberius began laying his trap. Letters praising Sejanus became more frequent and more effusive. Honours and appointments flowed from Capri to Rome. The emperor seemed more dependent on his prefect than ever before. Sejanus relaxed. His network of supporters expanded. His confidence grew. He began making plans for the final transition of power. Perhaps a quiet retirement for the aging emperor, a regency for young heirs, a grateful senate confirming their beloved prefect as Rome's new protector. He never saw the blade coming. October 18th, 31 AD, the day that proved monsters could still do mathematics. It began like any other Senate meeting. Sejanus entered the Curia Aurelia, wearing the toga praetexta that marked his elevated status, surrounded by supporters and sycophants who competed to walk closest to power. A letter from Tiberius was to be read, another imperial communication praising the loyal prefect and announcing new honours. Sejanus took his place among the senators, basking in anticipation of fresh accolades. But the letter that Nevius Sutorius Macro began reading was not the one Sejanus expected. It started normally enough, praise for Sejanus's loyalty, recognition of his service, acknowledgement of his devotion to the empire. The prefect smiled as familiar phrases washed over the assembled senators. Then the tone shifted. Subtle criticism crept into the imperial prose. Questions about certain decisions, concerns about specific appointments, doubts about particular policies. Sejanus's smile faltered. Around him, senators began shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent. But Macro continued reading, and the letter's tone grew sharper. Criticism became condemnation, doubts became accusations, questions became charges of treason, conspiracy, and betrayal. By the time Macro finished, the Senate sat in stunned silence. Tiberius had just destroyed his most trusted advisor with words written from an island 300 miles away. Sejanus looked around desperately, seeking support from the men who had praised him just hours before. He found only averted eyes and shifting feet. Power, he discovered, was the most fluid substance in the world, harder to hold than water, quicker to evaporate than alcohol. Macro, who had secretly replaced Sejanus as praetorian prefect days earlier, gave a simple nod. Guards moved forward. The man who had ruled Rome in all but name was placed under arrest like a common criminal. Within hours, Sejanus was dead. Within days, his supporters were dead. Within weeks, his family was dead. Within months, his name was being chiseled off monuments and erased from records. Tiberius had demonstrated that distance was no barrier to vengeance, that isolation was no obstacle to power, and that trust, once broken, could be repaid with interest that compounded exponentially. But Sejanus's execution was just the opening note in a symphony of blood that would play for years. Tiberius's paranoia, dormant during his early years on Capri, now exploded with volcanic fury. If Sejanus, his closest friend, his most trusted advisor, could betray him, then anyone could. Everyone would. The trials began immediately. Anyone who had supported Sejanus faced charges of treason. Anyone who had benefited from his patronage faced suspicion. Anyone who had praised him in public faced potential execution. But the purge quickly expanded beyond Sejanus's actual supporters to include anyone Tiberius perceived as a threat, real or imagined. Senators who had criticized imperial policy, aristocrats whose wealth made them potential rivals, historians whose writings seemed too favorable to the old republic. The emperor who had once governed through law now ruled through terror. A denunciation from Capri became a death sentence in Rome. An unfavorable horoscope became evidence of conspiracy. A casual comment became proof of treason. Modern estimates suggest that hundreds died in the purges that followed Sejanus's fall. Senators, knights, aristocrats, their families, their freedmen, their slaves, anyone connected to the conspiracy, real or imagined, faced the headsman's axe or the executioner's rope. Rome learned to whisper. Dinner conversations became exercises in careful neutrality. Letters were written as if enemy eyes would read every word because they would. Children were taught not to speak their parents' names in public, lest some casual comment be interpreted as sedition. The city that had once debated policy in the forum now conducted politics in shadows, expressing dissent through silence and resistance through studied indifference. And through it all, Tiberius remained on his island, issuing death sentences like weather reports and executions like tax assessments. The man who had retreated from Rome to escape its poisonous politics had become the most poisonous force in Roman politics. 32 AD to 37 AD, the last act in a tragedy that had forgotten its own plot. After Sejanus's fall, Tiberius never again trusted any single individual with significant power. Instead, he governed through a rotating series of advisors, spies, and executioners, playing them against each other with the skill of a master manipulator and the paranoia of a madman. The empire functioned, barely. Provincial governors continued to govern, legions continued to guard the borders, taxes continued to flow into the treasury. But Rome itself became a hollow shell, a capital city ruled by an absent emperor through messages that arrived at irregular intervals and commanded arbitrary obedience. The stories from this period, whether true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, paint a picture of a man who had surrendered his humanity in exchange for absolute security. Tiberius allegedly trusted no one completely, not even his food tasters. He supposedly moved between different villas on Capri, according to patterns known only to himself, sleeping in a different bed each night to confuse potential assassins. The sexual allegations that define his popular reputation supposedly come from these final years. Ancient sources claim that Tiberius, isolated from normal human contact and convinced that everyone around him was either a potential assassin or a potential victim, sought satisfaction through increasingly elaborate and degrading sexual arrangements. But here again, we must remember the source of these stories. They come from historians writing decades later, describing events that allegedly occurred in complete privacy, reported by witnesses who would have faced execution for speaking about them during Tiberius's lifetime. More likely, the emperor's final years were characterized not by sadistic pleasure, but by profound loneliness. Surrounded by servants who feared him, guards who watched him, and advisors who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear, Tiberius became the ultimate prisoner of his own power. March 16, 37 AD. Tiberius Caesar died as he had lived his final years, alone, suspicious, and surrounded by people who were counting the moments until they could safely celebrate his death. The official cause was natural illness, probably pneumonia or heart failure. The emperor was 77 years old and had been in declining health for months, but Roman historians couldn't resist adding more dramatic details to his final moments. Suetonius claims that Tiberius died while traveling from Capri to Rome, attempting one final return to the capital he had abandoned 11 years earlier. Tacitus suggests that Macro, the Praetorian prefect, may have hastened the emperor's death to prevent him from changing his designated successor. Most dramatically, some sources claim that Tiberius actually recovered briefly from his final illness, sitting up in bed and calling for food, only to be smothered with his own bedsheets by terrified attendants who had already announced his death and feared his revenge. Whether he died naturally, was murdered by his guards, or was killed by his own successor, the result was the same. Rome's most reluctant emperor finally found the peace that had eluded him for 23 years of rule. The news of his death reached Rome before his body did. The celebrations began immediately. Tiberius left behind an empire that was militarily secure, financially sound, and politically traumatized. He had preserved Rome's borders, filled Rome's treasury, and terrorized Rome's elite into submission. His successor, Caligula, Tiberius's grandnephew and the son of the beloved Germanicus, was greeted as a savior, the young emperor who promised to restore dignity to the imperial office and end the reign of terror that had characterized his predecessor's final years. Within months, Romans would be nostalgic for Tiberius's competent tyranny. Caligula's madness made his predecessor's paranoia seem almost reasonable by comparison. But by then, the legend of Tiberius the Monster was already set in stone. The capable general who had secured Germany became the paranoid tyrant who had terrorized the Senate. The competent administrator who had balanced the budget became the absent emperor who had abandoned his duties. The lonely old man who had retreated to an island became the sadistic pedophile who had indulged his darkest appetites while Rome burned. History, as always, preferred the dramatic lie to the complex truth. So what actually happened on Capri? Was Tiberius the monster of legend, or simply a broken man who wielded absolute power with increasingly shaky judgment? The honest answer is that we cannot know. The sources are too biased, the evidence too contaminated by political agenda, the time gap too vast for certainty. What we can say is this: Tiberius was a man given impossible choices who made increasingly bad decisions under unbearable pressure. He inherited an empire that depended on his divine authority but treated him as a barely tolerated necessity. He ruled over senators who demanded his respect while plotting his destruction and citizens who required his protection while despising his methods. The sexual allegations that define his popular reputation are almost certainly exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. The political paranoia that characterized his final years was probably justified. People really were plotting against him, as Sejanus's conspiracy demonstrated. Tiberius was neither the competent administrator his supporters claimed, nor the sadistic monster his enemies described. He was something more dangerous and more tragic, a fundamentally decent man corrupted by absolute power and destroyed by absolute isolation. The story of Tiberius demonstrates why we must always question not just what ancient sources tell us, but why they tell us what they do. Roman historians had political agendas, cultural biases, and personal grudges that shaped their narratives as much as any facts they preserved. When we read about emperors who supposedly committed elaborate sexual crimes, we should ask, who reported these crimes? When were they reported? Why were they reported? What did the reporters gain by making these accusations? In Tiberius's case, the answers reveal more about Roman political culture than about the emperor's actual behavior. Senators who had lived in fear during his reign had every reason to justify that fear through lurid stories of imperial depravity. Historians writing under later emperors had every reason to contrast their patron's virtue with their predecessor's vice. This doesn't mean ancient sources are worthless. They preserve invaluable information about how Romans understood power, morality, and political legitimacy, but we must read them as literature and propaganda as much as history. But here's the part the textbook never says out loud. This isn't ancient gossip folded into a museum piece. It's happening now. Those island palaces just changed address. Mountain compounds, private jets, encrypted chats, curated feeds. The mechanics evolved. The result didn't. Isolation still breeds excess. Power still erodes empathy. Secrecy still invites cruelty. And the scary truth is simple. Civilians have almost no line of sight into what those spaces hide. We watch polished speeches, public appearances, crisis statements, and below that surface there are choices, privileges, and actions we will never see. Calls get screened, dissent gets muffled, deals are struck behind closed doors, people far from power pay the price for choices we only glimpse through leaks, rumors, or the occasional scandal. So yes, maybe Tiberius was smeared, maybe he was monstrous. The point isn't to settle that debate. The point is this: whether by propaganda or truth, the same forces that warped him are in motion today, and they are closer to us than we think. Those legends of debauchery and cruelty are frightening, but what's worse is the ordinary quiet decisions that go unnoticed. Who gets punished? Who gets protected? Who is invisible to the system? If you want to be angry about the secrecy. If you want to be afraid of what unaccountable people can do when there's no one to stop them. They don't need to be monsters on the surface. Sometimes they just stop being human on the inside. And that's not conspiracy talk. That's a civic problem. The remedies are boring: transparency, accountability, people in the room who care more about the common good than their own comfort. But boring doesn't mean unimportant. So judge Tiberius if you must, but don't pretend the story ends with his bones. The same dynamic walks among us in suits and uniforms and screens, and because we see so little, the worst parts can stay secret for a very long time. If you want these stories surfaced, not sensationalized, not sanitized, subscribe and keep watching, because history repeats when we only read the headlines and ignore the rooms where decisions are made. Leave your verdict below. Was Tiberius a victim, a tyrant, or something in between? And tell me, what modern palace do you think needs sunlight next?